I've seen a lot of people who were also at the Dresden event a couple of years ago, where I gave a presentation about what accelerates, how we can accelerate technological developments in cryonics. And I think the time slot that was allotted for that was about 30 minutes, and by the time I was done, it was an hour later, and then we had a lot of questions. So I'm going to take a little different approach now, trying to keep it a little brief. And then there's probably a lot more time to talk about a lot of these things, because it might be a lot of process, and I kept it kind of general, so then we can talk about the details through like more Q&A. What to expect in human cryopreservation in the next 5 years. Now, yesterday, when I was still working on my slides a little, it was 10 years. And then I looked at a lot of these things and I thought, I think we can do this in 5 years. So I'm being optimistic here, but I think there's a good chance we may see a lot of these changes in the next 5 years. But it probably we have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. Before we get to this, I wanted to briefly provide kind of a framework to see where we're standing in cryonics in general. So, like in the old days, we had freezing of patients. That invariably happened. Either they were straight frozen, or we used some cryoprotectant, but there was always a lot of freezing. Now, we have ice-free cryopreservation, vitrification. It doesn't mean that everyone gets vitrified, because that depends on a lot of variables. Some are within control of the cryonics organization, some are not. But in principle, we can have ice-free cryopreservation of the brain and most of the body. Also, a lot of those rented buildings and volunteers in those days. Nowadays, like the two major cryonics facilities in the United States, they own their buildings and they employ paid staff, so they provide a lot of continuity. If you read some of the older narratives about cryonics in the 60s and 70s, you see these patients just being moved from one rented place to the other, and then unfortunately the family stops paying, and that's it. So that's another thing. In the old days, it was all pay-as-you-go cryonics. The idea was, oh yeah, sure, we keep paying for the liquid nitrogen of these patients, and that will keep continuing, but it rarely didn't. So at some point, and I think the Upper Life Extension Foundation was a real driver in this effort, said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. We cannot provide this kind of false hope. Cryonics needs to be pre-funded, either paying it full in cash or through life insurance. And in addition, now we also have the patient care trust that allocate a portion of that money to care for patients, in principle, in perpetuity. So a lot of things have changed. I think cryonics on a much firmer ground. Suspended animation versus cryonics. Now, I think the word suspended animation has made some kind of comeback the last 10 or 15 years. It's often used for, you may remember the hydrogen sulfide or clinical deep hypothermia. And that's not what I'm talking about here. When I say suspended animation, I really mean metabolic arrest, no metabolism, and it should be reversible. So how this is different from cryonics? Well, in cryonics you do have the metabolic arrest, but right now, cryonics procedures themselves add additional damage. I think that is a very important point to recognize about cryonics as practice today. And what we would like to move to is what I would call medical biostasis, in which the critically ill patient is placed into cryostasis, but the procedure itself doesn't cause any additional damage. So let's unpack cryonics, because there are a lot of different procedures involved in cryonics. Well, there's standby, like the deployment of the stabilization team prior to legal death, which is very, very important. But I'm not going to talk about that right now, but as many of you may know, if you do not deploy a standby team on time, you have a lot of ischemia that translates in a lot of reperfusion injury and find something called the no reflow phenomenon that doesn't really allow the brain to be cryoprotected very well. So standby is very important, and I'll talk about it today. Stabilization. Well, prevent damage after pronouncement of legal death. I think one of the most important things in cryonics is to ensure that there is no additional damage in this rapid cool down before cryoprotection. Cryoprotection protects the patient against ice formation. Before we do this, even bigger cool down to liquid nitrogen temperature, we will introduce cryoprotectant vitrification solution to ensure that there is no ice formation. And then we end up with long-term care. Called storage, probably not the best word if you want to move to a more medical concept of cryonics. Medical time travel is an interesting, I think Brian Loke came up with that idea. Okay, cryonics procedures that cause damage. So let's look at these things and see where the damage occurs. In stabilization, well, in principle, we can preserve the brain by contemporary medical criteria without loss of viability, unless, and then there are a lot of reasons why that is not happening. Some of them are a lack of technology, some of them are logistic, some of them are legal, some have to do with the expertise of cryonics organization, but in principle, it should be possible during there's a cool down to 0 degrees Celsius to make that reversible. The way you should imagine it, let's say a person is pronounced legally dead, and then someone comes in and says, oh, you started your procedure, but now we have a cure for this. You should be able to reverse that, and then you're back where you started. And in general, I think a good benchmark to evaluate how good cryonics procedures are is to at each stage say, would it still be reversible? Can we go back? How close are we to suspended animation? Well, cryoprotection, that's where the problems are starting. Cryoprotectants are toxic. It is a matter of degree, but because of general rule, we can say cryoprotectants are toxic, and viability is lost at some point during cryoprotective perfusion. That's interesting because in the lab, in cryobiology, it is actually possible to load and unload tissue or cells with cryoprotectant and maintain complete viability. The reason why that is not really possible yet in cryonics is because we cannot reproduce these very rigorous protocols in the operating room of the cryonics facility. It would require that we do a very, very gradual loading of the cryoprotectant, and then when the cryoprotectant becomes more concentrated, we drop the temperature to about minus 20 degrees. Have you ever wondered why Elcor's vitrification agent is called M22? It stands for minus 22 degrees Celsius, because that is where that agent is introduced. It's in its higher concentrations. Now, at Alcor, and I think at CI to some degree too, the temperature is dropped below 0 at some point for the more concentrated parts, but it's not the same. So I wrote an article about this called Securing Viability of the Brain in Cryonics, and we don't know exactly where it happens, but at some point during cryoprotective perfusion, we're losing viability. Doesn't mean we're losing ultrastructure, but we're losing viability in the sense you would take a brain tissue sample and you would do viability assay, and it probably won't come back that well. Vitrification solutions cause cerebral dehydration. I talked quite a bit about that in Dresden a couple of years, and I don't know how many people really know this, but if you actually do a really good cryoprotective perfusion, you produce significant shrinking of the brain. I'll show an image later to see how it looks like. Long-term care, we store currently at minus 196 degrees Celsius at liquid nitrogen temperatures, causes fracturing. But I get back to stabilization. So how could we make stabilization procedures reversible? I was saying, like, in principle it should be possible, but I don't know. I think there might not have been many cases in which it actually was the case. Although there are some very fine case reports by Mike Darwin of cases that have been done in the 90s where he took very meticulous samples to see, like, how the patient compared to, like, normal physiological patient. And some of it look pretty good, but it requires quite an effort to make that part of the procedure reversible in reality. So here are some ways. Increase the cooling rate. Damage is a function of temperature. The faster we cool, the better. That alone doesn't cut it. Mike Perry and I once did a set of calculations to see what kind of cooling rate we would need to achieve in cryonics to stay ahead of the ischemic cascade. And we ended up with a cooling rate that couldn't even be approached by extracorporeal perfusion or liquid ventilation technology I will talk to about later. So very rapid cooling alone is not going to cut it. Improved cardiopulmonary support. In cryonics, we talk about cardiopulmonary resuscitation, of course, because the point is not so much to resuscitate a patient, at least not right now, but to make sure there is no additional damage. Monitor brain viability. That's not so much a procedure that will improve things, but we need to see how well we're doing. We need to know at what point can we still say, well, this procedure is still reversible. Okay, well, extracorporeal cardiopulmonary support. We heard about that in the previous presentations. I'm not going to talk about it very long. I just picked an image up the internet, so this is probably not what you would see in cryonics. It would be adapted for our use, not at all. But what would be advantages? Well, there would be improved cerebral perfusion, and there would be more rapid cooling. And what I actually should mention is currently, when a patient is pronounced legally deaf, we use something called thumper or a mechanical CPR device. And that is pretty good in conjunction with pretty aggressive cooling, but it leaves a lot of, it still leaves a lot to be desired. And our experience is also, if you do that for a long period of time, and it takes a long time to cool cryonics patients, you get a lot of things that you don't want to see, like pulmonary edema, or the efficiency of cerebral blood flow is really starting to decline. And I'm going to come back to this more often in this talk. Challenge with introducing extracorporeal cardiopulmonary support with surgical skills, like what surgical approach are we going to take in medical expertise? Now, it is certainly the case that the kind of expertise available to run cryonics cases is a lot better than it used to be, but this still requires a lot of thinking and development, and I think a lot more contracting with available medical professionals to pull this off. But it is possible. Pulmonary cooling. I think it's better known in cryonics liquid ventilation. The reason why I'm not calling it liquid ventilation here is that it's not really the point, although it's of course very, very good if it also means to ventilate the patient. But the idea is, how can we really rapidly cool the patient? And Mike Darwin once called liquid ventilation, pulmonary cooling, a bypass to a bypass. Even if we find ways to put the patient a lot quicker on extracorporeal support and do internal cooling, there will still be a period where we just have to quickly cool the patient, maybe even cool the patient quite a bit to to be able to feel comfortable doing that surgery. And the way liquid ventilation works is that you use an inert fluid, usually perfluorocarbons, and you cycle this in and out of the lungs. And since all blood goes through the lungs, the cold fluids actually, the lungs basically function as an endogenous heat exchanger. So that also allows you to cool a lot quicker. And cooling rates of that can kind of approximate those achieved by extracorporeal cooling. So that's really good. The challenge right now is research and development. I chose an image for this. That's where you see Mike Darwin actually using a very rudimentary approach of this technology in cryonics. I think many people don't know this, but it actually has been done. What he's basically doing is has an IV bag with perfluorocarbons, and he just infuses it into the lungs and uses an emergency medicine suction device to take it out again. But what you would really want to see is a device that is automated and can just cycle in and out these solutions, these perfluorocarbons. Brain viability monitoring. As I said, that by itself will not improve our procedures, but it can guide our procedures, and it can probably also tell us, like, okay, where do things go off track? Where do we start losing viability? One thing we can do, it's pretty basic, paramedics are pretty familiar with it, is measure expired CO2, called Untitled CO2 monitoring. It has a pretty strong correlation with the ability to resuscitate someone without cognitive deficits. And one thing we've seen in cryonics cases where it was measured, that it was a pretty good indicator of how well we were doing CPS. There are devices now that can actually monitor cerebral oxygenation. It should be possible to implement that in cryonics. One of the problems is, one of the challenges here is that a cryonic stabilization happens all over the place. There's a little bit in the hospital, and the patient has to be transported to an emergency vehicle, then an emergency vehicle drives to the facility. And if you do these advanced monitoring procedures, you have to make sure to that continues throughout the whole journey of the patient. So that's certainly a logistical challenge. Brain biopsies. I know it's Max Moore here now. I don't see him right now. There has been quite a bit of discussion in cryonics if it would be interesting to take very small microliter brain biopsies after cryoprotecting perfusion, and then to do viability assays or electron microscopy on it, and to see like, oh, okay, how does the brain look like after cryoprotected perfusion? I think it's coming, but I think informed consent is probably important here. Some people feel very uncomfortable with the idea of even like the smallest piece of their brain being sampled to look at things like this. So, cryoprotecting toxicity. So now we're at the cryoprotection part, things that are still preventing us from having full reversibility. Vitrification requires high concentration of cryoprotectants, and cryoprotectants are toxic at high concentration. There's almost no way around that. In fact, one thing Greg Fahey and Brian Woke at 21st Century Medicine had found in the 90s that if they use higher concentrations of weaker glass formers, that actually got better viability. And for a long time we were thinking, well, the lower the concentration of a cryoprotectant, the better viability. Well, that didn't turn out to be the case. But as a general rule, cryoprotectants are toxic at high concentrations. And you can further break that down into non-specific toxicity. There's still, I think, a lot of debate what that exactly is. And currently, I think cryobiologists are leaning more towards that it's protein denaturation. These very high concentrations of cryoprotectants kind of disturb the hydration cell around proteins. And then there's specific toxicity, and that is varied by cryoprotectants. Specific cryoprotectants can cause specific kinds of injury. Well, the solution is, keep optimizing cryoprotectant combinations. As you may know, most of the vitrification solutions that we use today are combinations of cryoprotectants, and M22 is quite a few of those. I'm not aware of vitrification solutions that are just mono agents. You can do it. I think one of the misunderstandings I think about vitrification is that it's really hard to do. Well, vitrification is already hard to do. If you use 70% DMSO, you don't get any ice formation. You don't get a whole lot of viability either. The trick is to have a cryoprotectant that is both very effective in inhibiting ice formation without decreasing viability. Something that are not being done really right now, except for a new company that has just come online, is high throughput screening of cryoprotectants in combination. Maybe there are combinations we don't know about that are actually really good, or maybe there are compounds we never even thought of and they're really great, and that would allow us to synthesize new cryoprotectants. Okay, I promise you this, it's not going to be great. Cerebral dehydration. So this is your brain after good cryoprotection. So this is CT scan, and you don't have to be an expert, I think, in reading CT scans to see that the brain is a little more dehydrated than normally a brain looks like. It's an Alpha patient, and yeah, that's not good. There's probably, there's not a whole lot of ice formation, but it comes at the price of low brain dehydration, because the brain is different from other organs in how it achieves vitrification. In most other organs, you introduce a cryoprotectant, it equilibrates, and that can inhibit ice formation. What happens in the brain, at least that's what we assume, is some of these cryoprotectants have very poor or no blood-brain barrier permeability. So you keep just withdrawing water. You just keep withdrawing it without replacing it, actually. So some of these cryoprotectants actually, in an intact blood-brain barrier, will not actually reach the other side very well. So how do we approach this? How can we get vitrification without brain shrinking? Well, one thing is to open the blood-brain barrier with what we're calling blood-brain barrier modifiers. And most of that work has been done by a researcher who was at the Cryonics Institute called Tubing. And these blood-brain barrier modifiers are pretty powerful. And what I mean by that is, yes, they open the blood-brain barrier, but maybe they do a little more. Maybe they have adverse effects on cells in general. And one thing that Yuri struggled with is to use these blood-brain barrier modifiers without causing a lot of edema as a result of that. Approach number 2, cerebral ischemia. It's kind of not, I'm not completely serious about this because that would be pretty bad, but blood-brain barrier integrity is a function of ischemia. One thing we see here in our lab is the longer the time of normothermic or cold ischemia, the more damage to the blood-brain barrier, and then you can actually do cryoprotection without dehydration. But that's probably not the road we want to take. We don't want to leave the brain without oxygen for a while to get that. There's a third approach. I think, well, I'm pretty sure we haven't heard about it very much because I'm not aware of anyone aside from our own lab working on this, and this is what I call brain-optimized cryoprotectants. I mean, maybe there are cryoprotectant solutions, maybe there are vitrification solutions that don't dehydrate the brain. fracturing. When you perfuse the brain with a vitrification solution, it should be robust against ice formation. You cool it down, and it gets more viscous, and it gets more viscous, and it gets more viscous, and at some point it turns basically into a glass. But in cryonics, we keep cooling, and we keep cooling below that temperature, and that causes thermal stress. And what that means in reality is that the brain can fracture even like in 2 or 3 pieces. Solutions for that. One is annealing. The general idea about it is to cool very slowly and then to drop slightly below the glass transition temperature and then maybe rise the temperature a little and just find that like sweet spot of relaxation that allows you to eventually cool down further without fracturing. To some degree, this approach is incorporated in Cryonics Protocols, but I'm not aware of any like annealing protocols that completely can prevent fracturing. And some people have speculated, I think Ben Bess was one of them, that there might be an annealing protocol that worked really well, but it would take like many years. And I think that's not very practical. Gas cooling, or also called persiflation. You can actually perfuse gas through organs. It does an approach that was popular in the 60s among researchers. There's not a whole lot of clinical applications I'm aware of, but you can perfuse a very cold gas through an organ and cool it to liquid nitrogen temperature. That might be an approach. There's at least one company that's pursuing this approach. And then there's intermediate temperature storage. The idea of intermediate temperature storage is actually very simple. We cool below the glass transition temperature, but as soon as we reach the glass transition temperature, we don't go much lower. So this opportunity for the tissue, for heterogeneous tissue to cause thermal stress and fracture doesn't happen. I think right now that is the most practical approach, and I mean we use it in our lab all the time when we do cryopreservation research. We don't go down to -196 because as soon as you're under glass transition temperature, you kind of know what you need to know. ITS is currently not offered in cryonics, but there have been a number of cases where patients were placed in an ITS unit because there was no fracturing observed in the descent to the glass transition temperature, and because Alcor had at least one unit to store these patients in, they said like, well, okay, then if there's no fracturing, let's take advantage of that. I think you're going to see gradually intermediate temperature storage becoming part of cryonics services, probably first at Alcor. The remaining discussion right now is what is the ideal temperature for intermediate temperatures? Nucleation. Now, nucleation may not translate into ice formation, but it may do so upon warming. And that raises another question is like, what is your resuscitation scenario? If you start doing resuscitation at cryogenic temperatures, well, maybe that nucleation is not much of a problem. But if that's not an option, it could be a big problem. If you go quite a bit lower, then you get to the point where thermal stress will start happening. So it's kind of, there's a lot of discussion that has been going on for quite some time now about the ideal storage temperature for ITS. And I just realized I didn't really explain very well how ITS works. The idea is like if you have liquid nitrogen, this temperature is -196. But if you're just above it, well, of course, the temperature is a little higher. So there is a point where the temperature will correspond to your ideal storage. And of course, that requires a lot of like cryogenic engineering. You can see here a very simple example of how that works. Here's a liquid nitrogen pool. Then there's insulation, and then the tissue, whether it is the brain or some other organ, is in that sweet spot where you have exactly that temperature. One of the neat things about it is it's not dependent on electricity. So in case of failure, the worst thing that can happen is that the temperature drops again to liquid nitrogen temperature. That's not really what you want, but that would have been the default option in the first place. So it's pretty fail-safe in that regard. Okay, so now I'm going to do just a summary of things you're going to see in the future, or hopefully you're going to see. And some of these things are pretty far along, others are more like, well, it would be really great if we would have that. Extracorporeal cardiopulmonary support. I don't think it's an active research program, but I know that Suspended Animation has a strong interest in it. They certainly have the surgical skills to facilitate this. Pulmonary cooling against suspended animation. I think they've built a number of prototypes for liquid ventilation that they're testing. One of the challenges, you have to often ship these things all across the country in airplanes, and yeah, so it has to be very robust, but you also have all your complex electronics in it. So that's a challenge. Brain viability monitoring. Helper's certainly interested in that. Suspended animation, who does most of their non-Phoenix procedures, has an interest in that as well. Novel cryoprotectant, well, 21st century medicine, who developed M22, the cryoprotectant that Alcor right now uses. Of course, has a very strong interest because they're still working towards consistent, reproducible organ cryopreservation. As you may know, M22 was once used on kidney, a rabbit kidney, and it was fully reversible. And after transplantation, the kidney was fine, the donor was fine, but they had a hard time consistently reproducing that result. But they have a lot of research programs going on now to get there. My own company, Advanced Neural Biosciences, has an interest in it. There's a new company called Exterma. They are, as far as I'm aware, mostly inspired by mimicking natural anti-freeze proteins that find animals, and see if we can improve upon that and use it in cryopreservation. Blood-brain barrier modification. Yeah, I'm not so sure who really works in it right now. I don't know what your Pachugan is doing right now. I think he assists in CryoSuisse cases, and I think he does research for them, I think. I'm sure he's still working on that. 21st century medicine has an interest in. I know that they use blood-brain barrier modifiers in this new technology called aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation. I know how many people you've heard of that. They actually won a prize with it. What they were able to do is cryopreserve the brain after it was chemically fixed, and the brain was indistinguishable from a control brain. This is a really, really big deal, and phenomenal achievement. Of course, the problem is fixative, like irreversibly destroy viability, at least by contemporary criteria. So that's not really the end of the road. Brain optimized cryoprotectants, that's something we're working on. I can talk a little bit more about that if you want to. Gas cooling, Paradox Biomedical, they're in the Bay Area, I think. It's Steve and Tanya. Tanya Jiang and Stephen Sickle, they used to work for Alcor. They started this company into immediate temperature storage. It's in 21st century medicine technology, but There's at least one unit alpha right now, and it may be further developed and introduced in the near future at alpha. Okay. So the last slide I'm going to show you is some work we've been doing in our lab with these, what I call brain-optimized cryoprotectants. So this is in a rat model, and I know you don't have to know a whole lot about the rat brain to see that these two brains there on the left are pretty dehydrated. So this M22 is L4, that's PM1 of the Cryonics Institute. And this is a brain-optimized cryoprotectant that we're developing. As you can see, that rat brain is pretty similar to a control rat brain. These other two, not so much. It's a lot of dehydration. We're very new to this. We only started researching that this year. But if we can find one of these brain-optimized cryoprotectants that actually also has good viability, it's kind of what I was saying earlier. Vitrification is easy. Brain-optimized cryoprotectant, we didn't find that too hard in the sense of preventing ice formation without dehydration. As soon as we realized how to approach that wasn't too hard. But viability, that's another story, and that is something we're going to really work on next year to see how well these brain-optimized cryoprotectants do in terms of viability. So that's very exciting. If this works, and we can develop that, or we develop it in collaboration with other cryobiology labs, there's finally a good approach to preventing extreme dehydration using chronic cases without having to use these blood-brain modifiers that, well, kind of irreversibly destroy the blood-brain barrier. So that's it for me. Thank you. Okay, yes.
I have 3 quick questions, beginning with this one.
Yeah.
Could you participate in the Brain Preservation Foundation Prize? Because this could be interesting. That's number 1. Number 2, my Spanish team here, we work with 4 universities in Spain, and we're looking for cheap and interesting research for graduate students. And 3, I am one of the signatories of the evidence-based cryonics document. Mm-hmm. And I think this should be relaunched, or I don't know, and to get more PhD medical doctors supporting that. We just had a couple of medical doctors before, so they should sign that too.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, so you had 3, right?
Yes.
What was the first one again?
That is like Brain Preservation Foundation.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, of course, that is yeah. That's one of the first things that occurred to me as well. I think when we develop this further and it has reasonably good viability, well, technically, I mean, we could submit brains to the Brain Preservation Prize even without good viability, because as you know, that's not really what they're looking for. That is maybe one of the flaws in the prize, but currently if you can just show very, very good ultrastructure, that's good enough. If these agents can do that, that would be great. If they don't, then we have a bigger problem than dehydration. So it's certainly going to be very interesting to see how these agents affect ultrastructure. If most of the compromised ultrastructure we see can be attributed to this extreme dehydration, well then we should be good. If there's more going on, well, at least we solved dehydration, but then there's more work to do. So we'll see. But yeah, it's certainly interesting. But I think they already awarded the small animal prize, so I think it would mean that we would then use these brain-optimized cryoprotectants in a larger animal model and submit them. As far as collaboration is concerned, yeah, I think if we really feel confident, and we're not at that stage yet about these agents, then we certainly need other independent labs to look at this too, and there's a lot of room for collaboration there. About the Institute for Evidence-Based Cryonics letter. So I think the way it came about is when Elker was in a lot of trouble with the Ted Williams case. and a number of people were the driving force behind that letter. Like really wrote like all the PhDs they knew, all the doctors. And you can also see the signing dates. Most of the people who signed was all around the same time. But you're not the first to say like, well, let's do something more with it. I mean, how many people are there now? Like 80 or something? We should be able to get that to, you know, a couple hundred people at the very least. Absolutely. Yes?
Is there any usefulness of for cryonics, or the techniques, the technique that is used for food preservation at low temperature, that is based on letting the cells vibrating with the electromagnetic field till when the temperature is low enough, and then freezing very quickly.
Right.
And I think cell alive or something.
Yeah, I got that question a lot, and I will say when it comes to like utilization of high pressures or electromagnetic fields, that is really not a topic I don't know a whole lot about, but my understanding from cryobiologists who have looked into that is that it may not be too like effective for what we're trying to do. When it comes to like food technologies, or even like anti-freezing proteins that occur in nature, what we know is like these things can do meaningful work at relatively high sub-zero temperature, but when you go really down to very low temperatures, there's almost no way around replacing a lot of the water, the liquid parts of the cell with the cryo protectant. But as to the specifics of these different approaches of inhibiting ice formation, I cannot really tell you. It does seem when it comes to conventional cryopreservation with high concentrated cryoprotectants, we are pretty close. But as Greg Fahey, who is like the pioneer in this field, often says, when he solves one problem, then you know another one comes up. Ooh, that's a lot. Okay.
On this problem with brain shrinking and deep dehydration, one could argue that it's maybe not such a problem, the volume shrinking, as long as the connectome between the synapses and the neurons stay more or less conserved. Could this be an argument, or is it already quite clear that the connectome is really destroyed, changed during the shrinking?
Well, we know that when you chemically fix the brain and then cryopreserve it with blood-brain barrier openers, we know now that it looks really good. When we do conventional cryopreservation, it looks reasonably good, but it certainly doesn't look like control. So that indicates that something, presumably dehydration, contributes to that. There's another line of evidence, and when Jürgen was doing research, he tried to do viability assays just after cryoprotective perfusion to see, like, you know, how viable are brain slices that I extract from the brain after cryoprotective perfusion. And what he found is that after he really dehydrated those brains, viability was pretty poor. When he used the blood-brain barrier modifiers, viability was a lot better and sometimes close to controls. And of course, the one caveat is he saw a lot of edema. I don't know exactly what these blood-brain barrier openers do, but to the rest, to other cells, but they're pretty powerful. So maybe there is some, like, you know, increased permeability in general cells and to get a lot of edema. But yeah, to answer your question, we have evidence that this degree of dehydration doesn't produce very, well, ultrastructure that is indistinguishable from controls, and we know that viability assays don't look too great after this degree of dehydration. And I use the words this degree of dehydration because maybe some of it's fine, and maybe it used to be the case actually that extreme dehydration in chronic was seen as like a good thing because it meant like we minimize ischemia, we know that the brain is very well equilibrated, we not only inhibit ice formation through vitrification, but also by withdrawing water from the brain. but it's a matter of degree. And I think there is a consensus now that the degree of dehydration, that's just too extreme. You saw it in the photos that I ended my slides with, and you also saw it in the CT scan. And maybe this degree of dehydration is so extreme that it could even create some kind of like mechanical damage because you're really compressing things.
Aschwin,
Yeah.
how much of a sense of urgency do you think the cryonics or movement as a whole needs to have about the issues you've raised?
Yeah.
Because you've raised them in a very objective, matter-of-fact way of saying, well, there's an issue here and maybe there's a solution here. What I haven't heard is how important it is that we get together on accelerate fixes.
Yeah.
What's your view? Does it matter if it takes 5 years and we don't have much improvement made, or is it something we should all be passionately concerned about?
No, I think so. This is the topic that I talked about quite a bit in Dresden like 2 years ago. It's like what makes technological progress in cryonics happen, like what prevents it. And I think a really big one is how you think about the probability of revival or resuscitation. If you say, like, well, even if a lot of ice formation, if you can still infer the original structure of the brain from the damaged state, which I actually probably think that we can do that, you might be a little bit more grainy now, it's already good enough. But if you think like, well, we're probably not preserving well enough right now, then there's, I think, a much bigger sense of urgency. Although I think it's not mutually exclusive. I'm fairly optimistic about the capabilities of advanced nanotechnology, but you know, why cryopreserve someone in a state that is suboptimal? Why not shoot for something better? And I think the reason why there's not a whole lot of recognition for that is that cryonics doesn't have a very clear way of looking at it and say, like, oh, this is not good enough. For most people, you do procedures and you know, they end up in the door and that's it. Like if you go to a hospital for a specific medical procedure and that person doesn't come back or comes back in a worse shape, like, oh, that was not really good. So in cryonics, there are not really these kind of endpoints where you can say, oh, actually, we're not doing that well of a job. And that's why I try to break these procedures down and say, like, well, if you look at stabilization, we should not accept really poor viability because we know we can do that now. We know it's within our means to prevent fracturing. We should no longer accept that. Cryonics organizations should not start storing, in a new cryonics organization, why start storing at like nitrogen temperatures? Why do that? So yeah, I think it's very important to move to fully reversible cryopreservation because then it really changes a lot of the arguments we make in 2 ways. First of all, we can say like, look, we're just placing a critically ill patient in a condition that itself doesn't cause any damage anymore. And that really will strengthen the legal status of cryonics patient because if the patient is like not dead yet and placing that patient in cryostasis doesn't add any additional injury, then yeah, then like even the medical mainstream would have a hard time arguing that that person is dead. So I think it's very, very important for a lot of reasons to aggressively pursue that. And you know, being a member of the cryonics organization, like for example, ELCOR produces these case reports, and you know you can read them and go, look, you know, this the protocol you have and what actually happens in a real case. There's still disparity there, and we really need to bridge that gap between what we can do and what we routinely see in a cryonics case. Absolutely.
And just to follow up, you gave the talk in Dresden a couple of years ago, and this is sort of the same talk. What's going to prevent you doing the same talk again in another 2 years? What's going to be different?
Well, yeah, that is a good point.
But it is a good talk.
Yeah. Well, if I could have shown these slides like 2 years ago in Dresden that I ended with, I would have been a pretty happy camper. But yeah, I mean, it's up, you know, to people like you to like put pressure on your cryonics organizations and raise funding and like to make these things happen. I mean, I can identify where the problems are and how to do it, but you know, I clearly cannot do this on my own. And I think things are moving in the right direction, but I think it's also important to bring more medical professionals in who are familiar with extracorporeal perfusion. They're familiar with something like liquid ventilation, because then they will say, well, you're not doing this right. I mean, it could work, but you're not doing this right. And I think the more we would get away from this medical model, we just get into these, cryopreserve and store, and we'll sort it out like 2 years from now. And there's some talk here about, international cryonic organization. Well, an organization of that nature can push that kind of research along. And of course, there are also applications in mainstream medicine for this. Reversible brain cryopreservation could be very useful for brain banking. So if we really push, also emphasize the relevance of what we're doing for conventional medicine, for like brain banking, conventional organ preservation, stabilizing patients in trauma, military medicine, emergency medicine, that would be a good approach too. And then people say, oh, look, these people in cryonics, we did that first. And that certainly has happened. If you look at some of the procedures that have been proposed, or some of the equipment have been proposed for organ harvesting in hospitals, they're like, well, that looks very similar to what Elper was already doing in the 80s. And it would be great if someone could actually really draw attention to that. Yes?
Following up on what you just said about the importance of pushing for this research, what would you describe as the most effective way for, say, the standard member of the cryonics community, by which I mean someone who's not a multi-millionaire, presumably, to support, for instance, research into solving this dehydration problem? Is a fraction of the fees, the membership fees of certain cryonics providers, do they go towards supporting the sort of research your institute is doing, or are there more direct ways to support this research effort?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good suggestion, maybe, to allocate part of membership dues to research, or even maybe use this money. They don't say this is labeled to go to research. At Elper, that might be a little more challenging because, as you may know, membership dues are not benign, and there was a time, I think, where they were increased to such a degree that it actually produced some member loss. But it doesn't all have to be member dues. I think cryonics organizations have recently been doing a better job in drawing attention to research, their support, and saying where you can donate. Certainly Cryonics Institute has been doing that, and I think Elper does have a research fund. It's pretty well funded. In fact, there have been years like, what we're going to do with this money. And I think you're going to see a lot more aggressive solicitation for funding, so that can be channeled to research companies who address these kind of issues. Another thing is if we insist on better monitoring in cryonics, then these problems become really clear. Because if you say, maybe cryoprotectants have a dehydrating effect on the brain, okay, you can't really see it. To show you a CT scan, as I said earlier, people are like, that doesn't look too great. I'm glad that the brain was preserved without ice formation, but I can see why this has to be changed. But to get back to my initial point, is I think many people here are pretty concerned and want to improve these issues, but there has always been a subset of people in cryonics that said, well, I'm pretty much, I'm sure that you can already infer the original state of the brain from the damaged state, so it's good enough. That's clearly, I don't think that's acceptable, and it certainly will not lead to mainstream acceptance of cryonics, because I think one of the most consistent critiques is your procedures themselves cause a lot of damage, and maybe irreversibly so. So if we can work to that point where we can say no. So donate to the research fund of cryonics, or there are a lot of to these kind of things. It certainly looks better, like the kind of presentations that I'm doing right now. It's like there was not a whole lot of that, maybe even like 5 or 10 years ago, and you could really count on like on one hand, probably on one finger, like who was doing like real specific cryonics applicable research, and that has changed. Like in my second last slide, I was talking about all the organizations who are doing something to improve that, and that list has grown. And if projects like the organizations like the Organ Preservation Alliance, who actually are not so much working for cryonics, but they're really pushing the field of organ preservation, because in cryobiology for a long time people had really given up on organ preservation. And then there came this organization like a couple of years ago called the Organ Preservation Alliance, and they started really pushing that again. And they
Those are my students from Singularity University.
Yeah.
So I want to emphasize that.
Yeah.
They have been pushing this at Singularity University.
Absolutely, and that's great. So that is really back right now, in the United States. The Department of Defense has taken like a great interest now in these kind of things, and we're even talking about like using suspended animation for long distance space travel. So I think it's getting there. But when it comes to very specific cryonics applications, then we have to keep pushing our cryonics organizations to move this along.
Just a question.
Yeah.
If we talk about research and founding, is there anything going on with this huge brain project, like the human brain, like the brain in the US, like the Allen project? This is $1 billion project. So there is really a huge gap between what we are discussing here and the money which is, So what's the problem? Why this project they do not? You mentioned the brain,
Brain preservation.
brain banking and things like that. They should have maybe a part of this funding dedicated to research more in this area.
I know that the Brain Preservation Foundation, Ken Hayward, who is one of like the inventors and driving forces about these very high resolution brain images, he sees that link, and that's why he created Brain. He says if we just will be able to flawlessly preserve the connectome, even without viability, then that should be offered as a medical treatment. So he started Brain Preservation Foundation, and they created these 2 prizes, and one has already been won by 21st Century Medicine by this technology, what I call aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation. And it was in the news quite a bit, but then it kind of like, it's like really hard to, but that brings me to like a whole different topic, and that is like, is cryonics being held back by technological feasibility, or is it mostly being held back by cultural and psychological reservation? You would think that scientists would think, well, it's held back by technology and scientific breakthroughs, but I think a fair amount of us are thinking that there's probably a lot more going on, and that is why some of the people really working hard to make these technologies happen do not really strongly emphasize the cryonics angle.
May I suggest that we take the additional questions during lunch, which is ready, by the way, now? Also in the interest of empty stomachs. Thank you, Aschwin, for your talk.